one of my assistants that traveled with me said, after all these years, this still gets to you, doesn't it? I said, man, we putting a man's body in there next to his mother's grave. Yeah, it gets to me. And I said, let me tell you something, young man. The minute it doesn't matter to you anymore, you need to leave the movement. It matters to me, every one of these deaths.
Hello and welcome. If you want a long view of the battle for racial justice and equality, there are few better witnesses than my guest today. He went from pounding the streets of America demanding change to having a direct line to the White House, attracting strong praise and sharp criticism for his style and tactics along the way. He is the civil rights veteran, the Reverend Al Sharpton, who has been on the front line of many of America's most notorious police brutality cases, including caring for George Floyd's family as Black Lives Matter protests erupted around the world. Soul legend James Brown was a father figure to him, and now aged 67 with a weekly TV and daily radio show to his name, he shows no signs of slowing down. He now has his latest book out, Righteous Troublemakers, in which he tells the stories of those who have protest thrown upon them. Reverend Al, thank you very much for being with me. And I thought I'd start by asking, is that how you describe yourself, a righteous troublemaker?
Well, I do. I think that it is, I got the thought of it from John Lewis, who was, of course, a congressman and beloved in the civil rights movement, saying, make good trouble. And I think that I've tried to be a good troublemaker all my life.
We'll come to your record and how that's worked and some of the tactics and how things have changed. But who are you trying to give voice to in this book?
I'm trying to give voice to people that I feel made tremendous contributions, but never got the recognition and the visibility that I think that they were merited. For example, most people in the United States and in around the Western world would not know the name of Claudette Colvin. Claudette Colvin, whose story I write about in this book, was arrested for sitting in front of the bus in segregated Montgomery, Alabama, refusing to give up her seat 9 months before Rosa Parks. But the local Montgomery black leadership didn't want to rally around her because they said she was too dark-skinned and she was pregnant and was unmarried. She didn't have the moral picture they wanted. It was her sitting in the front of the bus that inspired Rosa Parks. In fact, Fred Gray was the lawyer for both of them. And I wanted people to understand that so that everyday people would know that you don't have to qualify to be a troublemaker or a freedom fighter. Everybody has a contribution, and these people were just regular people that did some things that were amazing.
And yet some of the people that you're also talking about in the book have protests thrust upon them. It's not something that they set out to do, and because they find themselves a miscarriage of justice and they find themselves in the eye of the storm. How have you found their stories? And at times, I know you've personally worked with them and tried to get them ready for something like that.
They're ordinary people living just regular lives, and all of a sudden they're thrust out here in the middle of what becomes a maelstrom. I talk about Philonise Floyd, for example. Philonise was just a regular guy in Houston, Texas. Brother George Floyd, abused by police in Minneapolis. And all of a sudden, they become a global news story and a global movement. But Philonise, unlike me or unlike others, didn't choose to be an activist. He's thrust out there. And that's one of the reasons why National Action Network has been involved in a lot of these cases, is you have to remember when a police officer is accused of a misdeed or a crime, they have the police unions that back them up and provide them with lawyers and resources, and if they need a therapist, if they need people to help them with interviews or to advise them with media. Families have none of that. They wake up one morning, their brother, their cousin, their son is dead. Nobody's there to help them. That's why National Action Network provides all of that, because you need an institution to go up against institutions, and we can provide all of that.
You're talking there about the organisation that you head up to, which helps people.
Exactly.
I mean, you say in the book your job was to build a firewall of support around the Floyd family, to guide, to protect them. I mean, even though what had happened was horrendous and then became the symbol of a newly ignited kind of global movement, do you think that they could be prepared for it? I mean, are they still sort of coming out of that now?
I think that they showed tremendous growth and tremendous ability, but they had to have people that would advise and guide them. So the perception is that people like Sharpton and others run in when there is trouble. No, we're called in. The Floyd family called me. I mean, can you imagine you're mourning your brother, in Philonas's case, Philonas Floyd, brother was killed. How he was killed, you're watching on television every night, and how this is killing you. But there's 10 TV cameras outside your door that wants an immediate response, and you don't know if you'll say something that might hurt the case that you want prosecuted against the policeman. So you need people that'll say, be careful, don't say this. Don't say something out of rage that they can use later. All of that comes with building a movement, and all of that happens to people that decide, I'm going to make trouble for a system that's unfair, but I'm going to do it in a righteous way. And that's why I talk about it. I got the idea, Emma, because when, in the middle of George Floyd, since we're talking about it, they had asked me to do the eulogy at both his funeral in Houston and his funeral in Minneapolis. And I remember in the middle of my delivering the eulogy, just for whatever reason, it hit me because I've always been an extemporaneous speaker, because I started preaching when I was a kid, so I don't use a manuscript. And it hit me, and I said, we need to march on Washington. We need to bring the issue of police reform and police misconduct to Washington. We had over 200,000 people. And I'm on my way to the steps where Dr. King had spoke in 1963 to make the speech. I have the families of George Floyd with me, family of Ahmaud Arbery with me, family of Jacob Blake, family of Breonna Taylor, about 15 victims' family. We're all walking toward the stage. And in these throngs of people, I see an old man that was jumping up and down with an object in his hand trying to get my attention. And I say to the security around me, I said, what is that old man trying to tell me? And they says, well, Reverend, we need to keep you moving. I said, no, but this old man, he looks like he's in his 80s. He's trying to say something. Go get him. And they went and got him, brought him to me. And he showed me what he had in his hand was a button. And it said, March on Washington, freedom now. He said, I was here in 63 with Martin Luther King, and I want to be here today with you. And this is the button I wore in 63. And that kind of haunted me. I never forgot that man, because he just went back in the crowd. And I said, you know, there are people that have paid a price, went to the marches, went to the rallies, some went to jail, some were killed, that knew they were never going to be in a newspaper the next day. They were not going to be on the news that night. They were just righteous troublemakers. They were there for the cause. Suppose if people like me called a march and nobody came. These people came, 200,000 people in the middle of a pandemic at their own expense, at their own risk. Why don't we that have the limelight put a limelight on some of them? And that's where the book concept came from.
On that point, though, I was wondering, when you get that call, you yourself, because you have been doing this for so long, faith is obviously a huge part of your life. How do you deal with that? Because you're still seeing people losing their lives. You're still seeing these police brutality cases.
I think if I didn't have a deep spiritual life and faith, it would overtake me, because it hurts to stand over these funerals and look at these bodies over and over again. I've done, since George Floyd, maybe 10 funerals of victims. Since then, there's no way that would not wear on you unless you had a faith to believe that this is the work that you were born to do. I'm watching families. I'm trying to comfort them, and at the same time asking myself, God, how long will this last? How many times do we have to go through this before the laws are changed? So if I were to tell you it didn't get to me, I would be lying. I tell you, and I wrote about this in the book, after George Floyd's funeral, the last one in Houston, and we had the long motorcade to bury him next to his mother. And I remember I did the prayer, I did the committal of the body, and then I hugged the family and I left to head to the airport to head back to New York. And I had my head down and a little teary-eyed. And one of my assistants that traveled with me said, after all these years, this still gets to you, doesn't it? I said, man, we putting a man's body in there next to his mother's grave. Yeah, it gets to me. And I said, let me tell you something, young man. The minute it doesn't matter to you anymore, you need to leave the movement. It matters to me, every one of these deaths.
How much do you feel faith is baked into the politics of America, though? Because it's very distinct when you're looking in that it's so linked. And you can see people on different political sides defending their views or using sometimes Christianity in particular to say this is God's will. Do you think that faith is being weaponized in American politics in a way that is just unhealthy?
I think that it has definitely been weaponized in a way that's unhealthy, because I think that we've used faith as a way of making people other than us or that other than believe wicked, and therefore if you can make them wicked and make them some kind of anti what God would want, that it justifies treating them unequally and treating them unfairly, which is why I think people of faith have to say, I'm motivated by my faith, but I want to protect people's rights that may not even have a faith. I remember when I came out for LGBTQ rights many, many years ago, and I even supported gay marriage. Some of the clergymen that I preached for in their churches as a guest minister said to me, Reverend Al, I don't know if we could have you to church this year because a lot of our parishioners are not with you on that same-sex marriage. And I said, well, okay, then I'm not coming.
I think when there is just a blurring of the lines, as there still seems to be in America at times with faith and with politics, I mean, it can be that people do not see it as the law, they see it as imposing people's views on them. And I wonder what you think would come first, an atheist president of America or a female president?
Well, I probably would say a female president, but I don't rule it out. I mean, when I got started as a youngster in the movement, I never thought I'd see a black president. So it would not shock me that either would come, but my guess would be a female president. We already now have a female vice president.
Indeed. Well, it's still not happened, but I suppose whatever political side you're on, the candidate has to believe in God and has to prove it in some way, which is striking regardless of how you come at it. Just talking about the phrase righteous troublemaker, and I was thinking about what happened just over a year ago on the Capitol. You know, those rioters would probably describe themselves in a similar way, as righteous troublemakers. They believe in what they are doing. They believe in what they're marching for. And I suppose, what would you say, being someone who's protested your whole life and being so divided from those with a view who have of what they're doing being just as worthy as what you're doing?
I would say to them that what will make the difference of whether what you're doing is righteous or unrighteous is the end goal. What are you trying to do? They were there that day, January 6th, to stop the certification of an election that the American people had chosen a president. If you're going to have a righteous cause, the goal must be righteous, and your behavior to achieve the goal must be righteous. Neither was the case in the January 6th insurrection.
Because some say what happened on the Capitol was the beginning of something, not the end of something. And 75 million people voted for Trump in the last election. And I just wondered, from your side of things, as it were, how do you see this playing out if the sides just can't talk to each other? Because you've built movements.
I think that I agree with those that say January 6th was the beginning of something. they are not going anywhere. They have gone into states now changing voting laws. They have built an infrastructure around this big lie that Trump really won and that they want to in some way control how votes are counted and how votes are done. I think we're in for a long season of confronting voting rights and different sides opposing different sides on these questions. And I don't know that we are going to be able to get to this dialogue of healing for a minute now. I think this is going to play itself out. I think the election of Joe Biden and the 4 years of Donald Trump has divided the United States more than I've seen it in my lifetime.
Looking at movements then, and looking at how things can hopefully get better or improve. Of course, as I say, you've been protesting, you've been on the streets for a long time, and you've seen things that you couldn't have imagined, like a black president, like you just said. But I was just thinking about tactics and changing approach. Of course, many hailed the Black Lives Movement protests because they didn't erupt in violence. They didn't erupt in riots, although there have also been divisions within that. Some factions calling for the defunding of the police. Just a word on that. Where are you on that? And where do you think the movement is on that? Because there is division.
I think as any movement, there's always going to be disagreements within the movement. I grew up in the North. The year Martin Luther King was killed, I was 13. I was already youth director of his chapter in New York. There were people that disagreed with Dr. King. They're saying that they believed in self-defense, not nonviolence. They believed in, then you had those on the other side that had condemned Dr. King for coming out against the war in Vietnam, saying that we should be for whatever President Johnson wanted because he was a good civil rights president. So these disagreements exist. I think that we need to reform the police, but we need to keep a measure of policing in our communities because we have high crimes. You've got as much a problem with gun violence as you have a problem of dealing with police that are over the line and do things that are wrong and that in many cases are criminal. So I think that it is restructuring how you put the funds and how you fund policing, but you must have policing. 3 weeks after I did the eulogy for George Floyd's funeral, I did the eulogy of a 1-year-old child that was killed in a crossfire of gangs fighting in Brooklyn. So we need both. We need good policing, funded properly, that deal with things like mental health and gun control.
And there's also, of course, this push and hope that the police themselves will report bad cops, will also come forward and have that culture change within there, as well as the training and the policing that they've got to do that you talk about. I'm just thinking about people who may be thinking of themselves in the way that you've described, a righteous troublemaker, talking about making good trouble, as you said right at the beginning of our conversation. And if you think back to your younger self and how you've changed as a protester and your tactics, what is your biggest regret and what's the lesson you've learned?
What I've learned is that you should not shoot from the hip. We often say tit for tat. Reporter or somebody say something, I'm almost at the beginning of their last word answering them. Be more thoughtful to make sure whatever you say and whatever you do and whatever tactics you use is toward achieving the end goal that you profess. Because people are depending on you and they expect you to be thoughtful, not just theatrical.
One of the controversies that is still brought up by your critics is your response to the 1991 Crown Heights riots in New York. To remind our viewers, these took place after a 7-year-old black boy was killed in a motorcade, by a motorcade transporting a rabbi. Violence broke out after that death and a Jewish student was killed. Your critics say you never called on the rioters to stop their anti-Semitic inspired violence. Is that fair?
That's totally erroneous because as the state of New York did a study, I was not even in Crown Heights when the young rabbi student was killed. I was called by the family of the 7-year-old kid the next day. But many in the fringe right wing try and distort that I was somehow should have called for them not to do what they did that night when I was living in New Jersey. But these are the kinds of things that you have to deal with, and you keep going. That is not only unfair, it's untrue.
That's why I wanted to ask you about it. I mean, you did mark the 20th anniversary of the incident. You wrote an opinion piece in the New York Daily News, and you said our language and tone sometimes exacerbated tensions and played to the extremists. And actually, there was a response from the young man's brother who responded saying he felt your recollections were sanitized and distorted. So there's obviously still a lot of hurt and pain there.
Oh, yeah, but again, we're talking 30, how many years ago? All you have to do is go to the State Report, who, by the way, criticized David Dinkins, the mayor, then, and others, but said Sharpton was not there. Now, I said that when I came in, that maybe I could have, as I did the eulogy for the 7-year-old kid's funeral, said more things that would have been, that I today would say differently. But to say that I incited or excused violence is just not true. And even in his brother's statement saying sanitize or whatever as a matter of opinion, he could not say that I incited violence.
I suppose it's just when you are looking back at tactics and how protests happen and the leadership, I suppose, that you've had, it's about also learning from that, which is what I wanted to ask you about, because you'll be well aware of these criticisms over the years.
Right. I think that what I've learned and what I share is keep your eye on the prize. What is it that you're going for? Don't react to the crowd. Don't play to, Mrs. Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King used to tell me, don't play to the cheap seats to get the roaring of the crowd. She said, think about what you're trying to achieve and speak to that. And that's what I've had to learn.
I just wanted to ask about the next generation of leaders that you have in your sight, particularly around racial equality. Are there some that you are particularly keeping an eye on?
I have many in my National Action Network and some beyond that I'm looking at. I won't call names, but there's some that are very impressive. And I tell them that they've got to learn in their generation what works, and they're going to be tested, and you're going to be criticized. And being a troublemaker, you're going to have trouble, because the fact that you're questioning, speaking truth to power, power is going to answer you. So make sure you are absolutely committed and want to be that and do that. But keep your eye on the prize. Don't make my mistakes. You can study people like me and others, but study also where we fell short and correct them as we go.
And also health, I imagine. You have an amazing regime. You could keep going for longer, I suppose. If you don't mind me mentioning, you've lost an enormous amount of weight and you post about drinking your kale juice every day and you look great.
I've lost 176 pounds over the last 4 years. I'm a vegetarian, eat one meal a day, work out 35 minutes every morning, and I'm in better shape now at 67 than I was at 37.
Well, long may it continue. And do you work out listening to James Brown? Of course, a huge
lot
influence.
of times I do. He was like my dad. First time I went to London, James Brown brought me, he played at the Hammersmith Odeon. And I went with James Brown. He brought me to London. And I listened, a lot of his music is up-tempo, so it helps me when I'm on the elliptical or lifting weights.
That's what you're doing it too. Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you very much indeed for your time, your recollections, and some of your lessons.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you so much for being with us. Until we meet again, mask up, stay safe, and goodbye.